In this final segment, we're going to focus on the conflict or tensions that develop between the Native Americans and the colonists. We're going to begin first by talking about King Philip's War. And King Philip was another name for one of the Wampanoag chiefs who was known as Metacomet. And in 1675, three members of the Wampanoag tribe, and the Wampanoags, to look back, right, these were the tribes that held the pilgrims when they first arrived on Plymouth, right? Massasoit was the leader. He sent Squanto to be able to help the pilgrims survive. Well, at this point, Massasoit's son, Metacomet, was the leader of the Wampanoags. He was known as King Philip by the colonists. And he was angry at the fact that the British had tried and executed his men. They felt that they were out of line doing that. He was already upset that they had not been able to come to a compromise. He kept seeing the British taking more and more land away, and there was no compromise between the two because of that. And so tensions were already high. So after this event, war breaks out between the two groups. And in the end, it resulted with about 300 colonists dead and about 3,000 Native Americans, including Metacomet, who died. And this is significant because we're seeing how the tensions are rising. The conflict is rising in the region between the Native Americans and the colonists. And if we take a look at Native American allies and we compare the French and the British, right, it's very different between the two groups. The French had a better relationship with the Native Americans. They had allies in the Algonquin, the Huron, and many other tribes. And that was mainly because of the fact that the French were fewer in number in comparison to the British, right? They traded European goods. They didn't try to take over large portions of Native Americans' lands. They had married into and learned the language of a lot of these Native American tribes. So it was a very different relationship that the British, who was more hostile. And so for the English, the main allies were the Iroquois League. And for the Native Americans, their main objective was to protect themselves, right? To protect their land, to protect their trade, to keep their people together. So ultimately, their choice was to join whichever side seemed less harmful. And for a large number of them, the least intimidating side was the French side. And that's why the French ended up having a lot more allies than the English. The Ohio River Valley was a very important area because it was very fertile not only in land, but definitely very fertile in fur. So the French controlled this area, the Ohio River Valley area, and they had posts and forts all over the river in order to protect themselves from the English and protect their fur trading. The British wanted the area to take advantage of it to be able to get into the fur trade that was in the region. So they sent a young George Washington in his military, and his men were sent to be able to take control of the area. However, they were defeated. They were not able to take over the Ohio River Valley. But what this did do was it began what is known as the French and Indian War here in the colonies. And this French and Indian War becomes the first war that started in the colonies, and eventually it spreads into Europe. And in Europe, it's known as the 7 Years' War. And back in Europe, Britain and France not only were fighting one another, but also other countries in Europe began to take sides as they allied themselves to different groups of people. Eventually, the British are able to capture the city of Quebec and Montreal. And with the capturing of these two major cities that the French controlled here in the colonies, it brought the French and Indian War to an end, and the British were successful in winning. So the Treaty of Paris was signed to officially end the war, and with the Treaty of Paris, it significantly changed the layout of the Americas. The treaty gave Canada to the British. All the land east of the Mississippi River also belonged to Britain, except for the city of New Orleans, which remained under French control. And then Spanish Florida also was given to the British because Spain had allied itself with France, and so since they lost the war, they had to give up Florida. And so now we see that a huge amount of land now became British territory as opposed to before the French and Indian War. So this is definitely going to be very significant in the development of the Americas from here on out. Because of this new addition of land and because of the war, a lot of colonial settlers began to move west. And so more and more land was being taken away from the Native Americans. Pontiac was an Ottawa chief, and he led forces against these new settlements that were coming up along the frontier. Because of that, the colonists had to send in militia, and the British had to send in soldiers to try and keep the settlers safe. So, in order to stop all of this bloodshed and to stop using up resources out in the frontier, the Proclamation of 1763 was passed by King George III. He wanted to avoid conflict with the Native Americans. He didn't want to keep having to send military out to the frontier. So instead, he created the Proclamation of 1763, which banned people from settling west of the Appalachian Mountains. And the colonists here in the Americas were not very happy about this proclamation. They felt that they had every right to move west. This was their land in their eyes, and they didn't feel that they had any right to be restricted to doing so. And so for many of the colonists, they kind of ignored this proclamation and continued moving west. And so conflict with the Native Americans continued long after the Proclamation of 1763 was passed. This proclamation is going to be significant, and this idea is going to be significant because this is going to be our first seed that is going to spark a lot of discontent and rebellion within the colonies as more colonists begin to view themselves separately than they back in England. So we're going to stop here, and this is going to end our segment here on life in the colonies before moving on to the causes of the American Revolution.